Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Suds, Snacks, and Socialism Virtual Forum. Today's topic is workers and the environment. How do we make a just transition? Our speakers today are Steve Ongerth and Michael Eisenscher. This forum series is a cooperative effort of the Alameda County Peace and Freedom Party, Bay Area System Change, Not Climate Change, and the Oakland Greens. I'm Marcia Feinland, and I'm the moderator today. We'll be starting with presentations by the speakers. Following that, you'll have a chance to ask questions and make statements. Please find the chat and participant icons at the bottom of your screen. You can signify that you want to be on the stack by typing stack in the chat or by using the hand-raising feature under participants. We welcome your various political opinions. We do not allow personal attacks on individuals. We're going to start today with Steve Ongerth. Steve Ongerth is a longtime Bay Area resident and union member in both the Industrial Workers of the World and ILWU, that's International Longshore and Warehouse Workers Union, as well as a longtime environmental activist. He's the co-founder of the IWW Environmental Union Caucus. Take it away, Steve.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, and thanks for inviting me to speak today. I'm speaking to you on occupied and lonely territory in Richmond, California, and it's a real privilege and an honor to be here. I'm going to cover some material that is available on the Environmental Union Caucus website, so I will drop that in the chat at the conclusion of my talk here. So I'll start by saying I think we all agree the evidence becomes more and more clear with each passing day that in order to avoid climate catastrophe and the irreparable destruction of our planet's biosphere, we need nothing less than a revolutionary green transformation of our civilization from stem to stern. These are sobering truths. The reassuring news is that the number of people that realize this and are prepared to act are growing day by day throughout the world. In spite of the threats of resurgent fascism, capitalism's perpetual meltdowns, and pandemics caused by the likes of COVID-19. The evidence can be seen in the following: a growing number of people willing to take direct action to protect the earth from ecological destruction, climate catastrophe, and capitalist extractivist projects, increased awareness of the inseparability of ecocidal capitalism, colonialism, racism, and misogyny, and this has corresponded with the growth of intersectional movements. The decline of climate change denialism, the cancellation of numerous pipeline and other fossil fuel mega projects, persistently high levels of support for transformative frameworks, even though they may be limited and flawed to some extent, like the Green New Deal. And notable among these trends are growing levels of class consciousness among climate justice and ecological movements, as shown by the rapid growth and widespread calls for just transition for workers affected by the transitions and transformations the current crises demand. These developments are welcome, and they point to both the broadening and the deepening of an anti-capitalist green transformational movement. However, no transformation can occur without the active support of the working class, and such support is but the beginning of what is needed to motivate the transformation. No revolutionary green transformation can occur without the participation of workers organized at the points of production and/or destruction, because it is precisely there that the capitalist class maintains its economic stranglehold and power over our civilization. So is achieving such organized power even remotely possible? The good news is the answer is yes. The not so good news is getting to yes will be challenging. The capitalist media paints a bleak picture of organized labor's stances on ecology and climate in the United States of America. For example, after the Green New Deal became a viral sensation following the Sunrise Movement sit-in of the Democratic Congressional Majority Leader Nancy Pelosi's office in December 2018, the AFL-CIO's Energy Commission published a statement in opposition to it. However, this commission is composed of unions that represent less than 20% of the AFL-CIO's total membership. It's entirely likely that many rank and file members of the represented unions actually disagree with their elected leadership. In fact, support for the Green Deal consistently polls higher than 67% among union members, which is slightly higher than the support among the people in general. Similarly, the capitalist media makes a huge noise about union support for fossil fuel capitalist mega projects, including pipelines, export terminals, and mining projects, and to some extent, that support exists, especially among the more conservative and male-dominated building trades unions, but this fails to present the entire picture. For example, almost 24 unions oppose coal exports in Oakland, California, and well over 30,000 union members oppose the Dakota Access Pipeline. It's a logical assumption that support for climate and ecological causes is already very high among union workers and the working class in general. It's also important to point out that the union movement is not a monolith, and this has been true for a long time. In fact, the same divide within the labor movement, that is the mainstream business union, trade union movement here in the United States and maybe North America, is very much similar and perhaps even the same as the divide that existed between the old American Federation of Labor, which was skilled craft workers who were largely white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and unions like the Knights of Labor and the IWW, which tended to be much more multiracial and intersectional and tried to organize unskilled workers and also tried to organize industrially as opposed to by craft. And, in the past, sometimes IWW members and other socialists called this red unionism versus yellow unionism. And when the CIO was organizing in the 1940s, there were the red blocs and the white blocs, the red bloc being the revolutionary unionists, which included communists and socialists and anarchists of various stripes, and the white class collaborationist bloc. And this to an extent exists today when the capitalist media refers to the white working class support for Trump. There's some truth to that. However, that's largely exaggerated. And many of these people that are counted among the white working class are in fact small business owners or petty bourgeois types, and some skilled workers among the trade unions, but not all of them. In fact, this divide existed up in Northern California during the timber wars when Judy Berry was actually trying to make alliances between environmentalists and timber workers. She pointed out, rightfully so, that a great many of the most rabid voices against preservation of old growth forests and the most rabidly anti-spotted owl demonstrations are not organized by timber workers, but actually small logging contractor owners. But the capitalist media, of course, spun this as the working class versus environmentalists. So it's very important to point out that these divisions exist within the labor movement, and sometimes what's counted as a labor movement isn't actually the labor movement. This is all well and good, but experienced organizers know that there's a stark distinction between support and action. It's very easy and low risk to have one's union pass a resolution in support of something, such as a mass march or the Green New Deal, or in opposition to another thing, such as a fossil fuel capitalist project of some sort. Likewise, there's very little risk in contingents of unions marching in support of the climate, the Green New Deal and the like, and to be certain, there's been a great deal of such actions taken by workers and their unions in recent years, and the number continues to grow. These developments should be welcome and seen as a positive barometer, but they're not enough. What would really make the difference is workers at the point of production collectively taking action in the workplace to use their leverage to bring about the transformation. Have such actions ever happened? The answer, again, is yes. However, until recently, there have been very few and far between. While there's been no shortage of what I call green unionism, which is support for environmental campaigns, maybe making a demand here and there, passing a resolution among the labor movement, actual instances of green syndicalism, which is workers taking collective action at the point of production specifically for environmental or climate-related causes and green transformations, has been limited. In fact, prior to the last few years, there really have only been two significant examples that I can think of. The first is the Australian green bans, which took place from 1973 to 1975. And that's an interesting subject, which I don't really have time to get into, but I will drop a link in the chat box for more information. And the Lucas Aerospace Workers strike in 1976. In that latter example, there was threats to shut down the Lucas Aerospace plant or to downsize it, and the workers were in the business of making weapons of mass destruction. And they actually organized, or a rank and file caucus organized, to try and demand that not only should they not lose their jobs, but the work should be transformed from making weapons of mass destruction into making things that society really needed, including solar power, which in the 1970s was very revolutionary. That such examples are rare shouldn't discourage us, though. There have been many more stirrings that, had the conditions been better and the organizing more strategic and thorough, they may well have developed into additional examples. One in particular from the IWW's own history comes to mind, and I already touched on this, and that was the efforts of Judy Berry in what's known as Earth First IWW Local 1 in Northwestern California, which involved workers in the timber industry. While these efforts failed to achieve the levels of militancy seen in the Green Bands or the Lucas Aerospace strike, they nevertheless proved that organizing workers in rural extractivist economies, what many in the U.S. might nowadays refer to as Trump country, including the incorporation of ecological demands, is entirely practicable. In fact, Judy Berry even convinced one logger named Ernie Pardini, who also joined the IWW, to conduct a tree sit. Berry's efforts weren't limited to or even primarily focused on ecological activism, however. A great deal of the work centered on workers' issues, including attempts at building collective power in the workplace. More recently, there have been instances of workers organizing in their workplace and making demands of their employers, specifically focused on climate and the environment, such as at Amazon. One might imagine that the economic crisis brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic would result in workers and unions relegating climate, ecology, and green transformations to secondary concerns. However, this has not happened, at least among unions which were already favorable to such things. Indeed, many of the recovery and stimulus plans that have been proposed and demanded, including those advocated by unions in the wake of the pandemic, include Green New Deal and Green New Deal type demands. As is the case with the deep and radical shifts against racism, white supremacy, and the police, and the carceral state that seemed to be unfolding in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, change often seems to move at a glacially slow pace until sudden ruptures cause rapid, almost instantaneous shifts. In reality, this happens because, drawing upon the metaphor of a frozen pond melting from below the surface, the view from above looks the same whether the ice is solid or razor thin. The actual shifts steadily progress beneath the surface and are usually invisible until the rupture actually happens. The situation with ecological issues, the climate, and green transformations are likely to be no less dramatic, and there are abundant indicators that a major planet-wide shift is imminent. In addition to the already aforementioned growing support for ecological issues and the like, we are also experiencing increased awareness of the impossibility of maintaining the status quo, not just in the danger to Earth's climate, but also the destructiveness of capitalist agriculture, the loss of biodiversity, and the danger of the planet's marine environments, deforestation, and what is being termed Earth's sixth mass extinction. Sorry for the tongue twister there. The collapse of fossil fuel capitalist dominance, which was already substantially weakened before COVID-19 hit due to a whole host of factors, but has now been catalyzed into high gear due to demand destruction brought on by the pandemic itself. And although there has been some recovery recently, that is not a long-term sustainable recovery. And a growing realization that capitalism cannot be reformed, it cannot even be repaired, even if just enough to maintain its legitimacy. And that the only sustainable green transformation can replace it if humanity is to survive. Now, such conditions do not make revolutionary change inevitable. Nothing is guaranteed, and everything must be organized. But conditions do play a role in making people, including workers, of course, more or less receptive to new transformative ideas. Given the body of evidence, it is highly likely that a revolutionary green transformation is precisely what the majority of the workers of the world desire. Certainly, the abolition of wage slavery cannot happen without it, nor, for that matter, can a truly revolutionary green transformation be fully realized without the abolition of wage slavery. Given the low rate of union representation among the working class and the even lower rate of unionization among workers in so-called green jobs, how can we hope to achieve these goals? How do we as workers build the organization possible to make these things happen? Well, these are some open questions, and these are things that I and others continue to work on. But the one thing we cannot do is give up. We must do what we've always said, and that is don't mourn, organize. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. We're now going to move on to our next speaker, who is Michael Eisenscher. He's a nearly 6-decade veteran of labor, civil rights, peace, environmental, and other social justice struggles. He's been a union activist, organizer, and labor educator. He served as national coordinator of U.S. Labor Against the War from its founding until he retired at the end of 2015. He's a delegate to the Alameda Labor Council from Peralta Federation of Teachers and a co-founder of its Climate and Environmental Justice Caucus. He also founded and is publisher of Solidarity Info Service, a social justice meme and headline news service. His articles have appeared in many online and print journals and labor anthologies. Take it away, Michael.
Well, thank you. Pleasure to be here. Like Steve, I am speaking to you from Oakland, which is occupied Ohlone people's lands, and also taking note of the fact that we are coming up on Mother's Day, a tribute to the mothers and women in our lives, the heroines of our lives. I'm going to take about 15 minutes to talk to you about a different aspect of what Steve has very capably introduced. The challenge of achieving a just transition affects not only workers in fossil fuel related or dependent jobs, it also concerns frontline and other communities, mostly people of color and the poor generally, that have borne the historical burden of fossil fuel pollution while being denied by institutional and structural racist practices access to better paid jobs in the fossil fuel sector. And it is also a challenge for local governments whose budgets are heavily dependent on revenue streams generated by the fossil fuel economy. But the concept of a just transition did not originate with the transition to a sustainable alternative energy economy. It has its roots, as Steve noted, in Cold War peace movement struggle against militarism and the demand for economic conversion of the military-industrial complex from prosecuting war and military expansionism to meeting urgent social needs. Moving to a sustainable energy economy and demilitarizing U.S. foreign policy both require a just transition for workers whose livelihoods are now dependent on fossil fuels and producing for the war machine, and for frontline communities and local governments. But what is too often overlooked by labor, environmental, and anti-war and other social justice activists is that they will not achieve their own goals for workers, the environment, oppressed people, or peace if we fail to simultaneously demilitarize U.S. foreign policy and decarbonize our economy. The military-industrial complex and energy-industrial complex are bonded at the hip. Taking on one means inevitably taking on both. Our militarized fossil fuel-dependent economy drives the government's militarized foreign policy. They feed one another. Our military provides the muscle required to impose the will of the ruling class on the rest of the world, driven substantially by the quest to acquire, exploit, and control the transport, sale, and use of carbon resources. In the process, the Pentagon has become the world's single largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels and the world's single greatest emitter of greenhouse gas pollutants. War and military aggression is itself an environmental nightmare, not only for those who are directly mired in a conflict, but also for generations that follow. The struggles for environmental sustainability against imperialism and war and for racial and social justice are inextricably intertwined and mutually interdependent. This must be understood to be a single struggle on multiple fronts. We must both decarbonize and demilitarize, or we will achieve neither. This will have an economic impact on industries, businesses, the workforces employed by them, for unions that represent them, and on government budget revenue for public services in the communities in which they work and reside. Businesses, communities, and workers who fail to anticipate and prepare for the changes will be most heavily impacted. Without a plan B, they're going to be unprepared for cuts when they come, will suffer the greatest economic hardship, and will have the most difficult road to recovery. The train is leaving the station. They have 4 choices. Get into the locomotive to be in a position to influence what route is taken. Ride in the caboose, dragged along by others who make those decisions. Be left at the station on the platform, or end up as roadkill on the tracks as the train barrels through. There are alternatives. It is possible to avoid the worst effects and recover from them more quickly if we act now to develop new uses for the physical assets and workforce skills, promote alternative community economic development strategies, and provide transition assistance to those most severely impacted. Conversion may result in diversification of products or services, transformation of the enterprise, replacement or reuse by other businesses, and even the possibility of transformation of the forms of ownership, introducing cooperative, municipally or employee-owner enterprises, and other departures from the traditional corporate model. Relative to many others in the workforce, fossil fuel and military industrial workers tend to be better paid, enjoy better benefits, are more widely represented by unions, and have greater employment stability. But whether they will be able to maintain those standards may depend on whether they fight to resist coming inevitable changes or are prepared to fight for a broader agenda than simply the maintenance of their own standard of living and employment security. The fight for economic conversion must be conducted within the broader struggle for economic justice for the most exploited, underpaid, underbenefited, those with the least security. This is the basis of a just transition. The fruits of the transition from fossil fuel and military dependency to just demilitarized, sustainable economy must be shared broadly if the transition is to be achievable and sustained. Our definition of environmental security or national security should be aligned with and defined by our values, not by our fears. Our values call upon us to address social conditions far beyond the parameters of the fossil fuel or military-industrial congressional complex. This calls upon us to look at economic development in new ways that are environmentally sustainable, socially responsible, equitable, and just, and that generate a national conversation about the kind of economy we need to have the kind of lives we want to lead in a society and economy that works for us all, rather than only for the privileged few. Rather than dictated by the mindless consumption of stuff, the pursuit of ever larger profits and economic growth, we need an economy that enhances social well-being and personal growth, an economy in service to the commons rather than profit maximization. Those whose jobs are at stake must see that they cannot secure their own futures and that of their children without making common bond with those who have no jobs, are marginally employed, work in dead-end jobs, or in the underground economy. If we want an economy that works for us rather than one in which we are at the mercy of multinational corporations and an economic royalty who answers only to itself, we need to figure out where opportunities for building unity and solidarity lie and aggressively pursue them. Austerity is a weapon of the powerful to extract advantage over the powerless. They become prosperous at the expense of the rest of us. The solution to austerity is shared prosperity, but that cannot be achieved by defining interests narrowly. Increasingly, success will be determined by the degree to which we learn to fight for our own interests by fighting for the common interest. This is not myopic idealism. It is the recognition of social reality and looking beyond the trench we are in at the battlefield on which we have been forced to fight. The struggle for a new kind of economy requires we build a labor movement that works for all working people, the poor and disadvantaged, not just union members. A transition that only protects the interests of those who presently perform the jobs will perpetuate existing inequalities and compound historic injustices. Any transition that does not include at its center a racial, ethnic, as well as economic justice component is not just and is doomed to fail. Economic transformation required to meet society's social needs is not something that can be accomplished without a movement demanding it. It requires that we develop ongoing partnerships between labor and our allies across the range of progressive movements. We must break down the walls that divide us. When we struggle against militarism and war, when we fight to create a sustainable energy economy, we are opening a space for the development of a social order governed by humanitarian values and ideals of justice, equality, democracy, and respect for human dignity. These changes cannot be made without moving from a consumer, profit-driven economy to a more democratic, communitarian, and cooperative one, from private to social control for the common good, rather than to serve the interests of profit-maximizing investors. At a 1984 International Conference on Economic Conversion held in Boston, an organizer, Suzanne Gordon, who might be familiar to some of you, Steve Early is her husband. Suzanne Gordon made the following observation, I quote, "The moment you say convert, you have to convert to what?" And immediately begins a democratic conversation about what we should be producing in the society. Whose interests that production should serve? Should it serve people in need, the majority of people in society, or should it serve to advance the profit margins of multinational corporations? It's a strategy about empowering people because it gives workers in a factory and community residents and people in need a say, not only in what is produced, but how it is produced. What's the technology, where it's produced, and so forth. So conversion really is a critical concept about democracy. Its central core is democracy, end quote. She was right then, and it's right now. An economic system that requires perpetual growth, ever greater consumption, and global conflict for its existence is a system that will lead ultimately to species extinction, slowly due to global warming, or quickly as a consequence of nuclear holocaust. This generation will need to make very difficult and disruptive changes that will negatively impact millions of workers, their families, and their communities. These kinds of changes have taken place in the past. The migration of industry to the Sun Belt, automation of manufacturing, deindustrialization resulting from trade agreements. These were investment decisions made by capital to maximize profits, not to protect people or uplift society. Working people understand the concept of intergenerational sacrifice. Most working class people are deeply devoted to their families and make great sacrifices to enable their children to have a better life than they have had. Our struggle for just transition is to assure that those sacrifices are shared by all. Those required to make the greatest changes or who have borne the greatest burden should get the most help. And conversely, those who have benefited the most should pay the most for it. The workers and communities impacted by the transition to clean energy in a demilitarized economy should not alone bear the social cost, and they and community allies should have a voice in planning for conversion to meet social needs. Unlike earlier technological and disinvestment changes imposed by capital in pursuit of higher profits, the changes we need to make now can be made with forethought and planning, and with as much consideration as possible for those whose lives will be most impacted. We will need to redefine what constitutes the good life. The quality of our lives should be based not on what we can acquire, own, and consume, but rather on the quality of our relationships, social welfare, and the common good. Will we be reactive or proactive? Will we cling to the status quo at the expense of future generations? Or will we be agents of change? Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said it the best, quote, "We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered, end quote. A new script is going to be written, one way or another. The question is, who will do the writing? Thank you.
Okay, so now it is participant time. You can find the chat and participant icons at the bottom of your screen. I see that Vicente's on the stack. Vicente, sorry. So I'm going to start with Vicente.
Okay. My question for both would be, do you think that the current two-party system would take care of any of these issues? And if not, what would your solutions be to actually dealing with a political system that tends to favor, especially the defense contractors?
Michael, you're next, then Ted Franklin.
There's a number of points that I'd like to make. First off, just on the, I think that between what Vicente raised and what Steve raised in his presentation is not exactly the same, and I wanted to pursue that a bit. That is, I am of the opinion that while the struggles will be on the shop floor level, nonetheless, the question of the broader questions will be decided politically. And the questions, I don't want to shortchange shop floor struggle, but political struggle, I think, is actually more important. So that's one point I wanted to make. The second point is, I wanted to make is the question of the just transition. My sense is different than Steve's. Also, it seems to me that we're not making the kind of progress that I was hoping for with the idea of just transition. There's a lot of resistance to it in the working class. Partly it's the same kind of resistance that breeds Trumpism, that is the cynicism that anything can be done, or that the pie is of one size, and if someone else gets something, then I'm going to get less. There's all kinds of obstacles to the idea of just transition, and which makes our task much harder, because just transition, I thought in the past at least, was an opportunity to attack some of the problems that we have of separation, that between people who aren't working, people who are.
Wrap it up, Michael. Time up.
All right, I'll stop. I'll come back if we have time for a second round.
Let's let Michael answer first, and then Steve. Oh no, I forgot about Ted. Go ahead, Ted.
I'm not going to make any points, but I will ask a question. And it's about, a newspaper that showed, whoops, I can't do it. Well, I don't have a background. A newspaper showed up saying miners union backs shift from coal in exchange for jobs. I saw this headline, and I had, it was the first I heard of this, that Cecil Roberts, of the president of the United Mine Workers of America, had done a joint press conference with Joe Manchin, in which Joe Manchin said he supports the PRO Act, and Cecil Roberts says he supports an energy transition away from coal, provided that there's on conditions. And I'm wondering, just interested in getting a comment from either of the speakers or both on that, whether you noticed that, whether you read the transition plan that the mine workers are putting forward. It was very interesting because he said, we talk about a just transition all the time. I wish people would quit using that. There's never been a just transition in the history of the United States. And then he also talked about it doesn't matter any transition, that you lose your job, whether it's a transition based on coal, oil, or gas, or any other industry. So any comments on those developments?
Okay, so thanks, Ted. So now we'll go to Michael Eisenscher.
Okay, those three questions are hour-long conversations all by themselves. I'll try to be brief. Two-party system. Let's face it, the two-party system exists. It's the one we are living with. It can't be wished away. So we have to fight within the framework of this battlefield that we have been given, not the one we want. Now we can struggle to build another party, but there are structural impediments that make it very difficult for any third party to have a viable ability to compete in a two-party dominated system. I think we've got to have an approach that says we fight on all fronts, which means we fight for political independence. We fight in the shops at the point of production. We fight in the community. We fight through building alliances with other forces. We fight within existing political party structures. We fight wherever that fight will take us. And if we're going to have any success at moving legislation that provides some of the protections we want workers to have, we're going to have to fight within the framework of a two-party dominated system. Number two, yeah, there is resistance. There's no question about it. But I think we shouldn't overstate it. Most workers, given the opportunity, will tell you they want their kids to grow up in a safe world. They don't want them to become victim to global warming. That means that they have to balance their immediate security needs for making a living and providing for their families with their ambitions for their children and for the future and for their own desire to live in a better kind of world. So I wouldn't stereotype people, whether that's coal miners who they want to hang on to their jobs. There's no question about it, because they're given no alternatives. So it's up to us, if we believe that they should have alternatives, to fight to create those alternatives. And that's going to require a multi-pronged kind of legislative and collective bargaining program that involves everything from pension portability to guaranteed annual incomes to single-payer health care to early retirement with no loss of benefits, all kinds of things that have to be built in order to make those changes palatable and therefore acceptable to people who understand that change is coming. And that's why I use that metaphor about the train leaving the station when I talk to working people about this, when I talk to my fellow delegates at the Labor Council, where we have an environmental caucus. I talk about the fact we got to make our minds up. Do we want to be in the locomotive or roadkill on the tracks? If we're not in the locomotive, somebody else is making the decisions. So we better fucking fight for being in the locomotive. And that's really what it's about. And that's why we're building inside the labor councils and in the Bay Area and across the country, we're building an environmental movement within the labor movement, just as we tried to build an anti-war movement within the labor movement. Because these struggles cannot be fought separately. They have to be fought as one. The miners' union, yeah, I think it's a real step forward for him to make that statement. And it took a certain amount of personal courage. But I think it also represents a recognition of reality on the part of his members who see the future and they understand their jobs are going to go away and they've got to now fight for what comes next. And that requires allies. And that means allies in the environmental movement. So that's coming. Steve?
Okay. Steve, do you want to weigh in on this?
Certainly. First of all, I want to agree with just about everything Michael said. And I will just sort of add on, since he covered a lot of it. as far as the two-party system, I mean, I'm full disclosure, been a registered member of the Green Party and or the Peace and Party for most of the last quarter century. More than two parties would have to be organized. That takes a lot of work, and that has yet to be done. And I think a lot of time is honestly wasted arguing, over whether or not people should work within the Democratic Party or not, or whether or not they should form a Revolutionary Workers' Party or not, or whether they should involve themselves in electoralism at all. I tend towards that last category myself, but what I've come to realize is there are different roads and methods of struggle, and if you spend all your effort trying to convince the other people working on their particular mode that they're wrong, all you're going to do is divide the working class, and it's just going to be a big energy suck. People are going to do what they do, and no amount of shaming them or arguing about it or sectarian screeds is going to change that. So my approach is to organize around the way that I think is the right way to do it. If others have a different opinion, I'm fine with that, as long as we have a common goal. And frankly, there's a lot of people who share the goals I have who have different methods of struggle. And I don't think it's worth my arguing with them or shaming them into trying to do things precisely my way, because that will just lead to squabbles and fights that just don't get us anywhere. And the fact is, historically, when revolutions have happened, they've always been multi-tendency. There's never been one particular tendency. It's never always been all anarchist or all Bolshevik or all social democrat or all Marxian socialist of some variety or another. It's always been multi-tendency, and where there are shop floor struggles, there are political struggles. Where there are political struggles, there are almost always shop floor struggles. I tend to focus on the shop floor struggles because I think that is where my energy is best spent. Other people have a different way of doing it, and that's fine. I will say this, though, when it comes to revolutionary workers' parties, I have had experience where I ran into revolutionary workers, people self-described as revolutionary workers' parties who argued that we should support coal exports to China because the Chinese working class deserves a first world standard of living. And they were also pro-nuclear power. Not exactly eco-socialism, if you ask me. Then there was the Leninist party that decided to abolish itself because it had been involved in covering up sexual harassment. There are anarchists I know who act like complete jerks and shame other people who happen to be part of DSA because they're all smug and sanctimonious about the right way to struggle. But that's not going to win people over to their views. So I think, speak your truth. Don't hold back, but be mindful of how you speak your truth and how you're coming across to other people. Are you winning people over to your way of thinking? Are you actually organizing the viable praxis that goes along with your theory, or are you just getting into arguments? And I say this as somebody who used to do a lot of the time-wasting, squabbling, sectarian assholishness, and I just don't recommend it because it's I could have saved myself a lot of time by learning to be quiet and listen a little more. Moving on to the matter of transition, I can understand Michael Rubin's frustrations in that. And it does seem like that, but again, I think Michael Eisenscher is correct. I think there is a shift happening, and I think there's far more focus and fixation on a very specific sector of the working class, mainly skilled, mostly but not entirely white trades workers in the extractive industry. And let's not mistake anything. Those are very important and key parts of the capitalist economic system, and it's an important linchpin that we cannot ignore. But the working class is much bigger than that. It's much more diverse than that. There's a lot of work that doesn't get counted as work, such as care work, that traditionally is assigned to the role of women, but is not exclusively so. Agricultural labor is work. I'm a transit worker. That's important work too. So is healthcare work. And a vast majority of people in the latter category are very much on board with the need for a transition. They recognize it. Lastly, on what Ted brought up about the miners union, I agree that is an important step forward. Yes, there are problems with it. The miners union is in favor of carbon capture and storage, which I think we all here would agree is a false solution. There are other things that they are calling for, such as they want to charge time of use for electricity use. Well, that's better than maybe just a flat rate because the heavy users might get charged more. But why not call for the collectivization and nationalization of electricity and have it be owned by the public, owned by the working class and run by the working class? You know, we're not going to see the leaders of the big trade unions suddenly become eco-socialists. That's not going to happen without a very well-organized radical rank and file pushing them. That has always been the case. That's why the IWW formed. The only reason why the AFL and the CIO later had industrial unionism to begin with is because the IWW and other radical unions like the Knights of Labor pushed on that. It's essentially what happens, and it gets back to the two-party system as well. I mean, I'll just finish by reminding everyone, although I'm going to mangle the quote, it was Howard Zinn who said, it matters less who's sitting in the White House than who's sitting in the streets and the boardrooms and so on and so forth. So in other words, it's radical grassroots horizontal organizing which really makes the difference, whether it's a two-party system, a one-party system, or a 10-party system. You know, we get socialism by organizing at the point of production. We don't ignore the political side of things. It's just a lot more complicated and nuanced than one versus the other.
We're going to move on to the next three people. Go ahead, Aisha.
Hi, my name is Aisha. I'm the branch secretary for the Boston branch of the IWW. It's nice to finally meet Steve. We've sort of been like internet friends for like a year, and it's like finally nice to like see your face and like hear your voice. So I want to respond to, I think it was like the person under the name who said like Jan and Michael, who said that like it was something like the working class aren't willing to fight for like environmental justice or something along those lines. I might be misquoting you, but like that's just kind of how I heard it. I think the big issue is that a lot of people in the working class don't know what like a just economic transition through the Green New Deal like looks like. Like, for example, like for me, like what that looks like to me is I took a class in renewable energy in college, and one of my professors built his house from scratch to be like super environmentally friendly. And it was like a really nice house. It was also like not that expensive for him to make on his own. And it was super nice. It had like great ventilation. And so it was like really like, it was really warm in the winter and like cool in the summer. And it was like really cool. And so like for me, like I have that in my head when people say that, but like if I never had that experience, like I personally wouldn't really know what the just transition to the Green New Deal looks like. And I think that like when talking to working class people, like if you're saying like, hey, under a Green New Deal, you would probably have a much nicer house or apartment than you do now. I think that would really like get people interested, like talking to people about like how like their material gains will like really improve. So I think that that's like one of the things. The second thing is I think if we want to like get more people into like environmental like justice and like into this work, I think currently the people who are like doing this like radical work in environmental justice in the United States is like Indigenous people. So I think like really engaging Indigenous people in the New Deal and also making them the leaders of the movement, because like this is like their land. And giving them leadership positions and interest in their leadership. I think like big thing is like interesting Indigenous leadership. And then the third thing I want to say is I think that's like really important is I'm trying to make this as concise as possible, is like working with workers and helping them like write demands around like environmental justice, because like I'm currently like unionizing my own workplace. I currently like process COVID tests at like a big lab, and I'm trying to think about like ways that like our workplace like could be more environmentally friendly. And like
seconds, please wrap up.
Yeah, and sure. And I'm really struggling with ideas. So I think that like if organizers want to help workshop labor, like want to workshop with workers around like how they can make demands in their workplace, that would be really helpful. But yeah, that's all I got.
Thanks, Aisha. Next is Bill Balderston.
Thank you, Marcia. First, let me say I've known both our speakers today for many years, and I just want to compliment them both as being two of the most consistent in linking environmental justice issues and the struggle in the labor movement, and they've both been exemplary. A few probably diverse thoughts. One is that for a lot of people, the term just transition is a level of abstraction, and at worst, something that has been a source of betrayal. And I think we need to see, there was reference to the Lucas workers in Britain, and I know that was a long time ago, but nonetheless, we need to see people actually functioning in a way where they're targeting not only a point of production, but what it means for the community. And I think we have to try to do that, for example, now in the context of the jobs/infrastructure program, is to what we think, even though we know that it may not get the resonance we want, what we think that should be. So mass transit is an obvious area of this versus putting in, I won't even say versus, but besides putting in, electric chargers for electric cars. We have to be, fighting both in our political work and in our union work. I would say in terms of union work as a teacher, that even though there is a move towards including environmental justice curriculum and supporting student activism, we need to link this also to the implications of it for workers. And likewise, as the demand of jobs for all gains more resonance, which I think it is, we have to talk about not just full employment, but what kind of work and what we're producing. And I think that's critical. And the last thing is, we talked about the interconnection, and Michael especially has been the most, most outspoken in a much broader circle about the linkage of militarism and environmental justice. I think that we also need to link both of those to the question of immigration. And I think it's another kind of just transition relating to the impact of imperialism. It's not just the militarist impact, but climate change causes massive dislocation for people who, as David Bacon points out, in many cases want to stay home.
Please wrap up.
Okay. And I think that's absolutely critical. It's a not a constituency, but a sector that we must consistently link to these issues. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Next is Jean Rule.
Well, thank you, Marcia. And I just want to thank the organizers and participants in this very important discussion we're having here. It is crucial. And those of you who know me know that I'm a retired union member. I still have my union dues deducted from my paycheck or my retirement check. So the union is very important for me and always has been. At the same time, I think it's important that as a worker, workers need to understand that unions are not their only organization through which they can exert power. There's also socialist political parties that are essential to pushing forward the demands. And for many years, as you know, I was a candidate with the Peace and Freedom Party. And when I endorsed the Green New Deal back in 2010, I think, and still push these ideas very strongly. So I would urge people to take a close look at the Peace and Freedom Party platform, because in my opinion, it remains the strongest platform on the left. And I urge you to read its position on the environment and the need for socialism in that regard. And then finally, I want to just mention that as a Marxist, I know that our slogan has always been workers of the world unite, not just workers of the United States or England or France, but workers of the world. And we need to look at the entire working class throughout the world. And we have to understand that the largest working class in the world is, of course, in China. And I think we need to pay close attention to the accomplishments of the communist world, not only China, but also Cuba and Vietnam, and their position in terms of ecology. For China, ecology is in their constitution. China has more green power in terms of renewable power, solar power, electric cars, and so forth than any other country in the world.
30 seconds, please wrap up.
And in that regard, I just know that China does produce even more pollutants than the United States, but it has 3 times the population of the United States. So its per capita emission of pollutants is less than United States. US is still number 1 in that regard. So with that, I will thank you for your comments. Look forward to further discussion. Bye.
Thanks, Jean. So now it's time for the answers from the panelists. This time we'll start with Steve and then go to Michael.
Okay, well, those are some good questions. I'll start with Jean. With all due respect, comrade, I've been a member of the Green Party and or the Peace and Freedom Party for 25 years, and its impact has been not very significant. And in the last election, Gloria La Riva, who ran on the Workers' World Party, got less than 0.5% of the vote in California, deep blue California, where Biden had not a snowball's chance in hell of losing. So it's safe to say that more socialists voted for a centrist like Biden than they voted for the candidate self-identified as a socialist. Now, I didn't vote for La Riva either. That's not to say that socialist parties can't be impactful, but currently I just don't think that they are. And I think a big problem with that is for most working class people, you have to be able to prove that what you're offering has some viable possibility of changing, and it has to be relevant to their lives. And that's not to say the idea is a bad idea. I'm just saying that currently that is not how most people see it. So there's definitely some perception issues that need to go on there. Also, I would be careful in holding up China or even Cuba or Vietnam as, perfect examples or even necessarily the best examples of socialism in practice. I would also be wary of condemning them as the capitalist class does or some doctrinaire anarchists do. I think there's good in all of them. I think there's bad in all of them. Our fellow system change and climate change member Richard Smith has written very extensively about China and has some deep criticisms of it, including the so-called record it has on the environment. So, and honestly, my knowledge on that is far less extensive than his. So I would definitely recommend checking him out. And this is, in all, full disclosure, somebody I've had some very intense debates with. So I don't always agree with everything Richard has to say, but I would definitely recommend you check out what he has to say about China. Lastly, on perception, addressing both Bill and Aisha real quick, one of my favorite parables is a story about a traveler who came to a land called the Land of the Fools, and the fools were afraid of what they considered to be a monster in a field nearby. It turns out the monster was a watermelon. The traveler went into the field and started to eat the watermelon, and then the natives of the land thought that this traveler was an even bigger monster. Sometime later, another traveler came to that land, and instead of going into the field, he taught the locals to slowly sneak into the field and then sneak up on the watermelon and then realize it wasn't a monster and then it was good to eat. And they overcame their fear. So in other words, in dealing with workers and all these issues, there's an old saying, facts just don't change attitudes. You have to build trust. And that is very challenging, especially when you've got cultural differences, differences of privilege, differences of language, differences of experience. And I don't have all the answers on that. But what I do know is that getting past this involves a lot of work. On a happy note, the Portuguese just transition efforts have had a long-running coalition between pragmatic union people and radical system changers, and they work together and they agree to disagree on where they disagree, and yet they've accomplished a lot. And I will post a link to that in the chat here, and I will let Michael finish up. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I'll try to be brief. In no particular order. I put a link in the chat to a half-hour version of the alternative plan about the Lucas Aerospace experience. I highly recommend you watch it, but actually look at the full 2.5-hour version, interviews with the shop stewards, about the actual process they went through to get workers who were producing weapons to rethink what their jobs would be if they could produce something else. Getting them to even start with the assumption they have a right to produce something else was a challenging question. So anyway, I'm not going to elaborate on that. They came up, by the way, we're talking late 1970s, I think 79. They came up with proposals not just for solar, for hybrids, for battery storage of electricity. I mean, they were way ahead of their time. And we can only imagine what might have been possible had they been allowed to proceed. Unfortunately, Margaret Thatcher had other ideas. I used to teach the political economy course in the labor studies program at Laney. I taught it for 6 years. And the first class, I always started with an exercise. I asked the students to tell me what they thought constituted a good economy. They would put down all that we read on the board. They'd throw out all the ideas of pension, housing, the job guarantees, things like that. We'd finish and I would say, well, wait a minute, there's something missing here. And people would be scratching their heads. We had a board full of ideas. I said, nobody brought up more police, bigger prisons, and a bigger military. Nobody. Nobody ever brings it up. In 6 years, nobody ever brought it up. I think if we start with a conversation with people about what they want from their lives, free from the constraints of what is, but what they would like, and then start there with how do we get to that? It's like, how do you eat a cow? One bite at a time. It's true. I think Gene's right. Unions are not the only vehicle, but they're an important vehicle. It's the largest organization of working people in the country, bar none. There's nothing bigger. Even its constrained size today as a labor movement, it's still the biggest. And so we have to fight within those unions for the political direction that the labor movement's going to take. And with that in mind, I'll end with this. For the last 4 years, 3 years, the Alameda Labor Council has been organizing what we call climate convergences, the labor convergence on climate or climate change. And this coming July, we're going to have another one jointly with the Contra Costa Labor Council, which importantly includes the unions that represent the refineries. And so this conversation is going on within the labor movement now. It's not something that is pie in the sky. Imagine it might be happening in the future. We're doing it. We just got to carry it deeper into bigger sections of the working class and engage people in imagining what their lives might be like if they had to make the choices themselves.
Thanks, Michael. So the next group of participants will be Gifford, and then I'm going to call on myself, and then Stan Woods. Go ahead, Gifford.
Okay, I agree with all the just transition proposals, but I do have a question for both Michael and Steve. I think it's a great idea, but let's say the advanced world is wasteful and consumes too much. The so-called third world or South or whatever you want to call it doesn't consume enough. Could you give us a vision of how could they be brought up? Like, for example, sub-Saharan Africa only has like a 40% electrification rate. Now, if those people want electrification, how do we bring about a just transition to bring the underdeveloped or the undeveloped world up to standards of just decent living for things like water and electricity and shelter?
Thanks, Gifford. That's a great question. Mine is different. I've been listening intently, and I really appreciate the speakers and all the participants. And I but when we envision this, the title is How Do We Make the Just Transition? And I'm still grappling with how we do it. I have the organized part. I'm hearing the organized part and the educate part, that people have to understand what an alternative could be. What I'm looking for is how do we take power? I think that, and I think that's the really hard part. And that's why some of us are involved in third parties. I'm in the Peace and Freedom Party. I think that working people need their own party. I don't think we get political power through the two major parties. I don't want to dwell on that because I don't have an illusion that our current alternative parties are actually necessarily the vehicle for taking power. I think at this point we're ideas, just to tell people the two major parties ain't going to do it. They're the parties of the rulers. But I'm going to leave it there. I just think we have to think about how we're going to, how do we institute workers' power politically? But my other question is about the problems with alternative power. We hear about electric cars and all this electrification. I just read an article about lithium. I mean, a lot of the ways that the sources of electricity and solar panels and things like that, they can be very extractive and using too much water in and of themselves. So I think we have to be really careful when we suggest alternative power, that we have to talk about how to do that sustainably. And now I'm going to go to Stan.
Yeah, hi. Well, I won't try to belabor too much of the points about the Democratic Party, but just a couple of things. If the whole issue of the Democratic Party was just a matter of endorsing or voting for him in this or that election, I'd still be opposed to it, but not as much. But the trouble is that it manifests itself in other ways. Strikes are settled instead of won. Michael knows this. Steve knows this. The BART strike was only a small victory, but it could have been won. But I'm sure you guys saw Gavin Newsom, who's then lieutenant governor, I think, wagging his finger at the BART union, not the BART manager. BART union said, this better not happen again. We can't tolerate this again. And then on the other hand, you had that guy, Steve Glazier, who was for outlawing public worker strikes. He's still welcome in the Democratic Party. He's not a pariah within the Democratic Party. Despite all the union participation and money, this piece of shit is still allowed to function and be in the Democratic Party. And they still endorsed him, which is mind-blowing if you think about it. So I just want to point out that if the third parties, and there's a lot wrong with Greens or Peace and Freedom Party, which I'm part of, as is Marcia and Dave and others, there's a lot of weaknesses, but a lot of the weaknesses are done by even some progressives doing their best to disable these parties. Like, I don't know if people are familiar, but in Wisconsin in 2020, the Democratic Party had a lawsuit to knock the Green Party off the ballot. And the Labor Party, and the Labor officials of Wisconsin backed that attempt. So if the Greens and Peace and Freedom or the Mountain Party in my home state of West Virginia are original, why is there such hysteria about keeping them from functioning? Why are there slanders? Why was Ralph Nader smeared as acting as a stalking horse for the Republicans when everybody knew that wasn't the case and he was just a Stalinist-like discrediting slander? So if we're going to achieve any of the proposed goals of the Green New Deal or whatever, the Democratic Party Steve Ongerth wrote, is not a monolith. Well, it pretty much is. When it comes to the nitty gritty, when it comes to affecting mass profits, they are pretty much a monolith. They'll rejoin the Paris Accords. They're not totally nuts. They want some green transition, but they're not going to allow any serious interference with the profit margin. One last point. Even though I haven't lived there in decades, only be back occasionally, I keep track of what goes on in West Virginia. And Mancini, which, by the way, he was originally Italian, but to show what a profile and non-courage this guy is, in response to Protestant anti-Italian bigots, he shortened his name to Manchin. He's a corporate guy through and through, and 100%, and so is his staff.
Time's up. Wrap up, please.
That's it. I'll basically wrap it up. And I only mentioned the ex-Green in Arizona. She's a really despicable character. But anyway, the Democratic Party won't work. Simply doesn't work.
Okay, thanks, Stan. Now we're going to go to the answers. And this time we'll start with, I forgot the order, but I'll start with Michael again.
Okay. I think Gifford's question is an important one, and maybe there are some lessons to be learned out of the experience with the pandemic, because it's a very much similar problem of where resources exist and where they need to be. Well, one solution, of course, was COVAX, which is, a way of redistributing some of the wealth or some of the
Vaccine.
vaccine resources. And there needs to be more. Another, of course, is to figure out how to impose upon fossil fuel corporations bigger tax burdens, and using some of those monies to help areas of the globe with less resources. A third is that in those countries, they are actually skipping generations of technology. They're not laying hard cable for telephones. They're putting in entirely cell phone systems. The same, they're not building big transmission terminals and power plants as much as they are now introducing solar and microgrids. And so we need to encourage and support that kind of development in order to help them skip stages at the same time that we put the brakes on our own energy consumption. I want to point out regarding China. China is not a workers' paradise, number one. And number two, it is not a paragon of environmental responsibility. It is the largest industrial polluter in the world, bigger than all the rest of the world combined. So yeah, they're making big strides forward, and they had to come a big distance to get there, but let's not glorify them and try to paint them as some kind of example for the rest of the world. China, in my view, is a capitalist country. It's a state capitalist country. So that's just where I'm coming from. How do we take power? It's like, how do you eat the cow? One bite at a time. You build bases of power in places where you can influence workers in struggle and build alliances in order to accomplish that. In some cases, that may be running independent candidates. In other cases, you may have no choice but to run Democrats or back Democrats. In some places, you'll do both. Lithium, yes. There's a real serious problem in trying to paint all renewables as equal. They're not. Some of them are resource intensive, and some of them are resource intensive in exactly the places where there are already the worst forms of exploitation going on internationally. So this is part of an anti-imperialist struggle as well. A struggle for resource control and also for alternative development.
Well, again, good discussion. Well, let's start with the answering Gifford's question. I mean, I agree fundamentally that this is a global struggle. It's not just about the global, and it's not just about renewable energy technology. It's about a green transformation from from top to bottom. One of the biggest organizations in the world is La Via Campesina, and they are very much a agricultural workers organization that started with the Brazilian MST, but has grown to encompass agricultural workers across the planet, from India to Pakistan. Even the British dairy farmers are part of La Via Campesina. The United States, they're not so big, although there's some contacts here. And their main focus is on agriculture, pushing for regenerative agroecology as opposed to industrial capitalist-based monoculture. And I think they're worth checking out. And I mean, they are certainly in favor of good renewable energy projects, but not bad ones, such as an attempt by state capitalist interest or even private capitalist interest, I forget which, to build a wind farm in Oaxaca, which is not welcomed by the indigenous people. So I agree completely that not all green technology is good, or not all instances of it are good. And on the matter of extractivism of the elements needed to build this technology, that is a big, huge discussion. And I agree fundamentally that we need to reduce extractivism as much as possible, but we also need to keep in mind that the framing that renewable energy means lithium extraction is a very oversimplified framing. The vast majority of rare earths and lithium are not used for renewable energy technology. They're used for things like cell phones, disposable computer parts, which become built-in obsolescence, and even in the fossil fuel supply extraction chain or the military, as Michael Eisenscher rightfully points out, is one of the biggest polluters in the world. So we have to be careful of not falling into what's essentially a capitalist framing. And indeed, as some people correctly pointed out in the chat, a lot of those minerals can be derived from recycling. In fact, up to 91%. I can even share some documents in the chat about that. And I'm certainly, as a transit worker, in favor of public transit as opposed to continuing automobile dominance. So these are very, very important discussions. There's been some really good literature written on them. They're potentially alternatives to lithium. But I will say this, there will have to be electricity. I don't think we can live without it. And it has to come from somewhere. And the best alternative is renewables. Even if we just use less, even 90% less of what we are using now, that's actually still worse than transforming entirely to renewables because we'd still be pumping carbon into the atmosphere. And if we switch to entirely renewables, the amount of mining and extractivism would go way down because a lot of that is for fossil fuels. Now, on the matter of taking power in the Democratic Party, oh boy, that is a very, very complicated discussion. I have been a member of the Green Party or the Peace and Freedom Party for 25 years, so you get no argument from me on the problems with the Democratic Party. They are many and they are numerous. But with all due respect to Stan Woods, there is no way with a straight face you can tell me that Lyndon LaRouche, who was a registered Democrat and ran as a Democrat for a long time, is exactly the same as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. There's absolutely no way that I can take a comment like that seriously. That doesn't mean that AOC is 100% great. It doesn't mean that I think the Democratic Party is all that useful. I don't. But I think a lot of fixation on the Democrats, in my opinion, tends towards codependency. It's kind of a way of saying the Democrats keep us from getting where we need to go, but I also think that's kind of an excuse for the fact that a lot of time our own organizing isn't as good as we'd like it to be. Don't like the Democratic Party? Well, you got to get to work and organize an alternative to it. And I've been at it for 25 years, and I can tell you that is not easy. As for taking power, it doesn't just happen at the political scale or the political arena. The one reason why the ILWU is as powerful as it is because it organized at the point of production and won a general strike. To me, that is how you take political power.
So with that, without having others speak,
I'd like to put in this last comment.
Go ahead.
For myself.
Go ahead, Norma.
We are still slaves. The fact that people don't recognize it or like to subvert it to some other description is not helpful. And I look for the day when people do see our relationship to our owners is their theft of our labor and the land for their profit. People who want to describe it as, what do they call it? Oh, no, it's wage slavery, as though that's different from slavery. I mean, the work situation is terrible. The same way as we hate school, we hate the job. And we're calling for it. We're desperate for jobs because we need survivalist methods. I certainly understand that. Meantime, the conversation, I say, needs to be expanded to talk about what we would like in the world. And from there comes the ideas about how to get it. You know, fund healthcare, for example, through modern monetary theory, which pays for everything without starving us, without hurting our own budgeting. So we are slaves today.
Okay, and I see Gene also has his hand up. And then after that, I think we'll be going to the closing remarks. We'll see. Go ahead, Gene.
And since no one else is on the agenda, I just wanted to respond to what I feel are incorrect statements on China and the socialist world in general. China is indeed the biggest polluter in the world, but less than twice as much as the United States. So since it is 3 times as large as the United States on a per capita basis, it is much smaller than the US polluters. And I think it's important to bear that in mind. It is so, and also in terms of the various renewables, all of which have their shortcomings, including electric cars, and I confess I do have one, but I would like to see them go, as well as all other polluting technologies. That's a bigger question. And also, I think we need to understand that the 2 biggest polluters in the world are the US military and the US ruling class. If these sources of pollution could be eliminated, that would be a very crucial part of the transition, I think. So I just wanted to throw those things out. And I have read that fellow Smith, I think he said he was, and simply don't agree. I'll just leave it at that. I would urge them to read more of the Chinese press on these issues.
Okay, so we are going to go in reverse order. Michael will have his 5-minute wrap up, followed by Steve-O. Go ahead, Michael.
Okay. Well, I want to go back to what I raised earlier. We need to do less talking at each other and more talking with our neighbors and coworkers. Talking with, not at. I think too much of what we do is preach. And frankly, preaching doesn't get very far. Why, you think about why the Jehovah's Witnesses are so successful and have been around so long. They actually go door to door and have conversations with people about values, about their aspirations in life. And I think that's the place where you start. I'm not going to get into a pissing match about per capita versus total pollution. In the end, we're all dead. I'm less interested in how much each of us individually contribute and who's the worst offender than I am in figuring out how we stop offending. And so we've got to figure out in our society, not to point the finger as much as we figure out what's the solution and offer people real solutions. The reason why there's a reaction by working people against some of these ideas is they don't see it as practical solutions to the problems they face in their lives. And so we've got to have solutions. With that in mind, one of the reasons we're having this convergence in July is to hear a report from Professor Robert Poland, who's at the Perry Institute. He's developed a technique for studying the economies of states, and he's doing one right now in California that will identify the particular jobs and occupations and locations and the number of jobs around the state that are impacted by a transition to renewable energy and the jobs that are going to be created in the process. And that's the starting point for figuring out a strategy for who's impacted and what we need to do to protect them, and whose jobs are going to be created and who's going to do those jobs, and then how to organize those workers. And so that's going to be something you can look forward to reading. That report should be available sometime in June. I think that's enough. Thank you. I appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you, Michael, for your participation. And now we're going to move on to Steve Ongerth.
Likewise, I agree with what Michael said, and I want to also thank everyone for this very interesting discussion. I will say, as to the comments in the chat, I'm really not interested in debating over the Democratic Party. Again, I'm going to say that is a dead end. There's going to be agreements and disagreements on that subject. And frankly, the vast majority of the working class doesn't care. What the vast majority of the working class does care about is having a livelihood and being able to survive. And I'm all for abolishing capitalism, the two-party system, and certainly do not want to work within the Democratic Party. But a great majority of the working class does. So that is a reality we have to accept. You don't have to like it, but that's the way things are. So let's, I honestly think that if we just continue to squabble about that, that is not going to get us anywhere. I don't think that is going to bring about the socialist revolution that most of us, I think, or all of us here want. I'd be happy to have that conversation some other time, but I'm not interested in having it here because I really don't think it's relevant to the discussion. I will leave you with one other thing. I wish I had time to cover this in the discussion, but I wanted to keep it brief at the beginning. But there's another whole aspect to this, and that is the challenges in addressing resource extraction workers, or particularly refinery workers. I'll briefly say in some ways it might be easier than we think, because a lot of what goes on refineries, a lot of what goes on in mining, a lot of what goes on in these industries actually isn't directly related to the refining process or the mining process. It's all the incidental stuff that goes alongside of it. So in some ways, the transition could be a lot easier. I mean, offshore oil workers could just as easily be retrained to do offshore wind, or they could be trained to do offshore oil platform decommissioning. In fact, there's a great document that the BOEM, I can't remember what it stands for, put out on that particular subject. In some ways, however, it may be harder than it seems. I mean, for example, for a lot of people who work in the industry, that's their cultural identity. It's part of their dignity. And it's not just them. Many unions have legacy programs in such that if you're a member of a union, there's a very good possibility that your children and their children could be a member of the union. The ILWU certainly has something like that. It's not like blatantly clear cut, but for example, when they open up registration every 10 years or so and they have a lottery, if you're somebody who's related to an ILWU member, you usually have a higher number than those that don't. So that's one thing that has to be kept in mind in having these conversations, is what are exactly the particulars of a given industry. But these are important questions, and I will humbly say I don't have all the answers to them. I don't have all the answers to the political questions we have here. Even some of the disagreements that we might be having in the chat, I don't have all the answers. I'm not going to claim that I do. But I do have experience. I have listened to other people, and I am a worker in a unionized shop, and I can tell you that what discussions go on there are very interesting, but they're not quite as politically intense or even all that focused as what we're having here, and they're about different subjects. So we have to keep that in mind. Any socialist revolution better be an eco-socialist one. It has to have the support of the working class, which means we got to listen to what working class people are saying, and we have to learn how to listen and learn how to agree to disagree when we don't agree. And we have a lot ahead of us. But I also think a lot has been accomplished by organizing, and a lot will continue to be accomplished by organizing. It's never going to be ideologically pure. It's always going to be messy and gritty. And I don't claim to have all the answers, but I don't need to have all the answers. And I definitely invite people to check out the website I maintain, ecology.iww.org. It has a lot of information about this. A lot of the debates we're having here gets covered there too. And again, thank you for having this. I hope we can have more of these in the future.
I want to thank everyone for participating, and I want to thank the speakers for their excellent presentations and for people with their thoughtful comments.